Memphis, 1956. The church is packed, every pew filled, the air thick with judgment. On the pulpit, a well-known local preacher raises his voice, sharp as a blade. His movements are the devil's work. His music drags our youth into sin. He is stealing the very souls of our children. Murmurs ripple through the crowd. Some nod fiercely, others wipe tears, clutching their Bibles tighter. A woman in the back squeezes a newspaper so hard it crumples, the headline screaming, "Elvis Presley, the pelvis." Across town, Elvis sits in his modest home. A friend hands him the clipping with the preacher's words. Silence fills the room. His father, Vernon, looks lost, unable to speak. His mother, Gladys, breaks down. "Son, they believe you're evil." Elvis stares at the page for a long moment. His jaw tightens, but his eyes stay calm. Finally he speaks, his voice low but unshakable. "If they believe music is evil, maybe it's time they hear my truth." And with that, the battle was no longer about songs or dances. It became something far greater, a fight for the soul of America itself. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The headlines came like knives. By the end of the 1950s, newspapers across America carried the same phrases in heavy black ink. Elvis Presley destroys morality. Presley brings sin to the youth. The devil's music finds a voice. Parents clipped those articles and carried them into living rooms, waving them in front of teenagers who had just discovered what it meant to feel alive through rhythm. Town meetings were called in small cities from Mississippi to Ohio. Pastors thundered from pulpits, insisting that a generation was being poisoned not by alcohol, not by crime, but by a boy from Tupelo who shook his legs and sang songs with too much fire. One of the loudest voices rose from Memphis itself. A preacher, stern-faced and sharp-tongued, stood before his congregation and declared, "This boy is no messenger of hope. He is a weapon of destruction. If we love our children, we must guard their souls against him." His sermon spread quickly. Newspapers quoted his words. Radio stations replayed his accusations. Suddenly, the city that had watched Elvis grow was also the one branding him as an enemy of virtue. Elvis read those words in silence. He was only in his early 20s, his fame burning brighter than anything he could have imagined just a few years earlier when he worked as a truck driver. The crowds were massive, the screams deafening. But for the first time, he understood that the love came with an equal measure of hatred. At home, the tension cut deeper. His mother, Gladys, sat with the papers spread before her, tears filling her tired eyes. She had always believed her son's gift was something sacred. She had told neighbors for years, "My boy sings for the Lord, not against him." Now she watched strangers describe him as a corrupter of innocence, and it broke her heart. Elvis tried to reassure her. "Mama," he whispered late one night, "I ain't singing to hurt nobody. I just sing what's inside me." But the doubt had already crept in. He could feel it in her trembling hands when she touched his face, as if asking silently whether the world might be right about him after all. The protests began small and then grew louder. At concerts, groups of adults positioned themselves outside arenas, holding placards shaped like crosses. Some quoted scripture as they shouted at young fans rushing inside. The noise of faith clashed with the noise of desire, two Americas colliding at the gates of a stadium. One evening, in the middle of a packed show, the clash moved inside. Just as Elvis launched into a song, a line of older men and women stood from their seats, holding handmade signs. The words were blunt. Elvis equals sin. They walked out in unison, leaving behind empty rows in a sea of screaming teenagers. Elvis saw it. His chest tightened, his voice caught for a fraction of a second. But then he forced a smile, straightened his shoulders, and sang louder than before. The music swelled, and the fans roared so wildly that the sound of the departing protesters was swallowed by the flood of devotion. The contrast was almost surreal. Thousands of young women cried his name, some fainting from the sheer rush of seeing him move. Yet, only a few yards away, stern-faced protesters hoisted crosses, chanting that he was an instrument of the devil. Backstage, the contradiction weighed on him. He wiped sweat from his brow, sat down with a towel around his neck, and muttered to one of his bandmates, "They think I'm evil." I just wanted to sing No Answer Came. The bandmate, unsure of what to say, simply tuned his guitar. Elvis stared at the floor. For the first time, he realized the cost of his fame wasn't only exhaustion or lost privacy. It was carrying the role of villain in a moral battle he never asked to fight. The pressure seeped into every corner of his life. Reporters asked him about the protests, often with mocking grins. Headlines tried to pit him against the church. Neighbors whispered about his family. Gladys, frail in health and already anxious by nature, carried the shame as if it were her own. Yet, when the lights went down and the curtain rose, Elvis had only one choice: to perform. And perform he did, as if the louder he sang, the more he could drown out the accusations. But deep inside, he wondered, how long could a man keep smiling when half the country was convinced he carried the devil in his hips? The hunt had begun. Not for justice, not for truth, but for a symbol. A single young man who, to some, embodied every fear about a changing America. Elvis Presley was no longer just a singer. He had become a battlefield. And in that battlefield, every song would be treated as a weapon, every step as a threat, every scream as proof that darkness was spreading. He felt it, heavy and unshakable. The love of the crowd did not cancel the hatred of the critics. They lived side by side, colliding every night like clashing cymbals. And he was caught in the center of the storm, carrying the impossible weight of being both adored and despised. The stage lights blinded him, but behind them lurked the shadows of those who called him evil. And as his mother's prayers echoed in his memory, he wondered whether his gift was truly a blessing, or the curse that would consume him. The accusations did not fade. If anything, the noise grew sharper, carried on the wings of every sermon and every headline. "Satan in a silk shirt," one paper wrote. "A wolf among the children," thundered another. Elvis understood by now that if he responded with anger, he would only add fuel to the fire. So instead, he chose silence. Or rather, he chose something stronger than silence: song. In 1957, while critics painted him as a corrupter, he entered the studio with an idea that surprised even his closest collaborators. He wanted to record gospel. Not the polished kind sung by choirs in marble churches, but the gospel that had lived inside him since childhood. The harmonies he had heard in the Pentecostal tents of Mississippi. The raw voices that had once lifted him out of poverty. He asked to record peace in the valley. The studio that day was dim and quiet. No flashing cameras, no screaming crowds, no fanfare. Elvis closed his eyes and leaned into the microphone. His voice, stripped of the swagger that scandalized adults, rose soft and trembling at first, then steadied into something almost prayerful. Each word seemed directed not to the engineers behind the glass, but to someone far beyond the room. Witnesses later swore they had never seen him more vulnerable, A man who could command stadiums with a hip shake now stood utterly still, hands pressed against the headphones as if every note was a confession. When he finished, there was no applause. Only silence, the kind of silence that feels like reverence. One technician muttered under his breath, "That boy just preached a sermon." When the record was released, radios across the country carried a very different Elvis into people's kitchens and cars. Instead of pulsing rhythm, listeners heard lines about faith, about valleys and salvation. For some, it was disarming. Mothers who had torn down posters of him from their daughters' walls suddenly sat at breakfast tables listening to his voice describe heaven's peace. A few preachers who had been his fiercest critics found themselves speechless. How could they call him an agent of Satan when he was singing the very hymns they themselves had taught? But the silence did not last. The most radical voices struck back quickly. "Do not be deceived," one Memphis minister proclaimed. "The devil can wear the mask of an angel. His gospel songs are camouflage." The conflict did not vanish. It deepened. For every letter of thanks Elvis received from believers who said his songs gave them comfort, there came another condemning him as a fraud. He read both kinds in private, sitting at the piano in his house, fingers tracing chords while his eyes scanned the looping handwriting of strangers. But what the public did not see was how often he carried his music into places where no cameras followed. On restless nights, when fame weighed too heavily, he would slip quietly into small churches across Tennessee. He didn't arrive as Elvis Presley, the star. He arrived as a son of the South, hat pulled low, walking in the side door. Inside, he would sit at an old upright piano, the kind that rattled when struck too hard, and sing low for the few who happened to be there. No spotlight, no screaming, just hymns, whispered prayers in melody. People who stumbled upon those moments remembered them for the rest of their lives. They said the man they met in those pews was not the provocateur from the headlines, but a believer searching for God the only way he knew how, through song. This duality became his hidden rhythm. By day, teenagers screamed his name loud enough to shake the rafters of arenas. By night, he poured out quiet gospel verses to handfuls of strangers who had no idea they were sharing a pew with the most famous man in America. The contradiction was almost unbearable, yet it was also the truth of who he was, both the idol and the worshipper, both spectacle and sincerity. Critics, of course, refused to acknowledge this hidden side. They pointed only to the gyrations, the screaming crowds, the unruly energy of youth. But for those who had heard him in a church basement or a small chapel, the memory never left them. One woman later recalled, "He sang as though he was begging heaven to listen. It didn't feel like performance. It felt like prayer." The radio carried his gospel songs into unexpected places. In hospital rooms, veterans recovering from war heard him sing about valleys and felt less alone. In kitchens, weary mothers stirred pots of beans while his voice filled the space with hope. Yet at the same time, the pulpits thundered louder. "He twists holy words into entertainment," one minister raged on a Sunday morning broadcast. "He deceives our children by mixing sacred with profane." Elvis never answered those attacks directly. He didn't write rebuttals, didn't argue in interviews. Instead, he returned to the studio, again and again, to sing hymns that had shaped him since boyhood. It was as if he believed that the pure sound of those songs could say more than any defense ever could. Still, the burden grew. He carried it quietly, letting his public self absorb the shouting, while his private self sought refuge in hymns. And every time he opened his mouth to sing in a church, or in a studio late at night, he was sending a message, not to critics, not to journalists, but to the God his mother had taught him to trust. The irony was cruel. While protesters waved crosses outside his concerts, he himself was slipping into chapels to bow his head. The world saw the flashbulbs, but it missed the kneeling. It heard the screams, but not the whispered prayers. For Elvis, the answer would never be words. It would always be song. And in that choice, he carried both his defiance and his devotion. A paradox that neither critics nor fans could fully grasp. Because for him, music was not a mask, it was confession. The summer of 1958 carried a strange mixture of triumph and dread. Elvis stood at the height of his fame, selling out theaters, breaking records, his name known in every corner of America. Yet another shadow loomed over him: military service. The draft notice had arrived, and soon the world's most controversial singer would be transformed into a soldier in uniform. Before he left, he tried to spend quiet days in Memphis. But Memphis was no longer quiet for him. Reporters camped outside his home, fans followed him through the streets, and critics filled the airwaves with speculation. Some predicted the army would straighten him out. Others said it would crush his career entirely. It was during one of those humid Memphis afternoons, as he sought a moment away from the frenzy, that he encountered the man whose voice had haunted him for years, the preacher, the same one who had thundered from pulpits that Elvis Presley was dragging souls to hell. The meeting was not planned. A mutual acquaintance had arranged for Elvis to stop by a modest community hall for coffee before his departure, and when he stepped inside the sweltering room, there the preacher sat, waiting. The space was plain: bare wooden chairs, a scratched table, the faint odor of strong black coffee mixing with the heat that pressed in from the street. The ceiling fan turned lazily, doing nothing to ease the heavy air. The preacher wasted no time. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, fixed on Elvis with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "You've already stolen a generation," he said, voice steady but loaded with disdain. "If you do not stop, you will go on stealing their souls. And you will answer for that." The words hung like smoke. Elvis did not respond right away. He sat in silence, jaw tight, hands folded in front of him. He had been insulted by reporters, mocked by politicians, condemned by strangers. But hearing it in this small room, spoken not to the public but directly to his face, cut deeper. Finally, he lifted his head. His voice was calm, even gentle, yet there was steel beneath it. "I don't preach sin," he said. "I sing what I feel. If people see evil in it, maybe that evil's in their eyes. Not in my song." The preacher leaned back, unimpressed. For him, words were easy. He had built his career on sermons and denunciations. He was ready to fire back, to drown Elvis in another flood of scripture and accusation. But before he could, the door creaked open. A young woman stepped into the room. She couldn't have been older than 19. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse to her chest. She was a member of the preacher's own congregation. Neither man expected her to speak, but she did, her voice breaking as tears rolled down her cheeks. "You don't understand," she said, looking not at Elvis, but at her pastor. "You don't know what his music did for me." The room froze. The preacher blinked, startled, but the girl pressed on. "I was alone," she whispered. "So alone I didn't want to keep living. But when I heard him sing, it felt like someone out there understood me, like maybe God hadn't forgotten me after all." Her confession cracked the silence like a bell. Elvis sat motionless, the preacher speechless. For once, his arsenal of condemnations deserted him. He looked at the girl, saw her tears, and had no scripture ready to erase them. Elvis's throat tightened. He wanted to comfort her, but no gesture seemed adequate. He realized that what she had said was the very thing he could never explain to his critics, that his music, however scandalous to some, carried life to others. And no headline, no sermon, could take that away. The preacher shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His authority, so solid in the pulpit, felt brittle here. For the first time, he seemed less certain, less unshakable. He looked at Elvis, then at the girl, and said nothing. The fan above them kept turning, the only sound in the heavy Memphis heat. In that silence, Elvis understood something profound. He didn't need to argue theology or morality. He didn't need to fight with words. His songs already spoke for him, sometimes louder than he realized. The young woman wiped her eyes and slipped back out, leaving behind a room heavy with tension and truth. The preacher remained, staring at his cup, his voice gone. Elvis rose slowly, nodded politely, and walked toward the door. As he stepped outside into the blinding sunlight, a crowd of fans spotted him and rushed forward, their screams cutting through the air. Flashbulbs popped, hands reached out. The chaos of his life swallowed him again. But deep inside, he carried the quiet memory of that girl's words, her tears, her salvation found in a melody. It was a moment no critic could erase, no sermon could cancel. Because in that small, sweltering room, stripped of glamour and fame, Elvis Presley had seen the truth of his music reflected not in the anger of a preacher, but in the gratitude of a broken soul. And it was that truth, not applause, not record sales, that would carry him into the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The departure came with a storm of flashbulbs. In March 1958, Elvis Presley boarded a bus in Memphis, wearing a modest suit and carrying little more than a duffel bag. The king of rock and roll was now Private Presley, drafted into the United States Army. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions. Fans cried at the roadside, holding signs that begged him not to go. His smile looked steady for the cameras, but inside, a very different Elvis was walking away from the life he had built in a flash. The train to basic training rattled through the American night, and for the first time in years, there were no screaming fans, no spotlights, no chorus of approval or condemnation. Just soldiers, young men like him, most from working-class families, heading into the same uniform. To them, Elvis was a curiosity. Some gawked, others smirked. A few muttered, "Let's see how the pretty boy handles this." The transition was brutal. In Germany, where he was later stationed, the barracks were cold, the food plain, the drills relentless. Gone were the silk shirts and studio sessions. Elvis woke at dawn, scrubbed floors, shined boots, and stood in formation like every other private. The military stripped him of celebrity. He was not Elvis here, he was Presley, 533-10761. Back home, the commentary did not stop. Some preachers celebrated. God himself has humbled him, one declared from the pulpit, as if the draft were divine punishment. Newspapers carried similar tones. Army life will break the rock and roll spell. Others predicted he would vanish into obscurity, his reign over youth ending as suddenly as it began. But inside the German nights, another story unfolded. When the barracks grew quiet and homesickness pressed against the walls, Elvis would sometimes sit on a bunk or borrow a guitar and let old gospel tunes slip from his throat. At first, the other soldiers jeered. "Sing us a hymn, superstar," one joked. Yet when he began softly with Precious Lord, "Take my hand," the mockery faded. Voices stilled. Boots stopped shuffling. The sound was not for show. It was raw, aching, stripped bare of stagecraft. Soon groups of men gathered around him in those dimly lit rooms. Hardened recruits, who had sneered at him during the day, found themselves listening in silence at night. The hymns reminded them of home, of mothers and sisters, of wooden churches back in Alabama or Texas, of Sunday mornings when life had felt simpler. In that setting, Elvis was not a scandal. He was a companion in loneliness, a soldier among soldiers, a man who understood the need to pray in melody when words weren't enough. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened back in the States. A small church in the Midwest, which had once denounced him as a devil's messenger, began using his recording of Peace in the Valley during Sunday school. The congregation's children sang along, unaware of the fury their elders had once poured onto his name. Parents, who had sworn never to let his records enter their homes, found themselves humming the tune as their children practiced it for church recitals. The irony was sharp. In the very pews where his name had been condemned, his gospel voice now echoed as instruction for faith. The contradiction grew sharper still. Some ministers doubled down, warning their flocks that even in uniform, Presley remained a dangerous symbol. But others softened. Perhaps, one cautiously admitted in a radio interview, perhaps God has given him this gift for more than fame. Elvis himself remained detached from the debate. He had no microphone in the barracks, no stage to defend himself. All he had were the nights, the hymns, the simple truth that music could still comfort men far from home. He didn't see cameras capture those moments, but the memory of them would stay with him. The look of quiet in a room full of restless soldiers, the hush that fell when his voice rose in prayer song. And as much as the army stripped away, it also gave something back. A grounding, a chance to see himself not as a spectacle, but as a man among equals. For the first time in years, he was judged not by how he moved his hips, but by how he carried his rifle, how he handled fatigue, how he endured. Back home, headlines still painted him as controversy incarnate. But in Germany, among the soldiers who heard him sing late into the night, Elvis Presley was not the devil's voice. He was a young man aching like the rest of them, singing to keep the darkness away. The irony was bitter but undeniable. In America, sermons still roared against him, yet across the ocean, men found peace in his voice. And in that strange balance, a new Elvis was forming, one who knew that fame could vanish overnight, but the power of a song whispered in the dark could never be taken from him. March 1960. After 2 years in uniform, Elvis Presley came home. The Army haircut remained, but the young man who stepped off the plane looked different. More serious, more controlled, less the boy who once shook coliseums into hysteria. Cameras flashed as he saluted, his smile restrained. The press, which had spent months speculating about his fall, now declared his return a national event. Hollywood wasted no time. Contracts awaited him. Movies lined up. His voice returned to the radio, smoother than ever, tailored now for ballads as much as rock. To his fans, it was as if the king had never left. But beneath the glow of the spotlight, a darker current stirred. The churches that had once celebrated his departure as divine punishment found no satisfaction in his homecoming. If anything, their warnings grew sharper. Sunday sermons across the South resurrected familiar accusations. "The devil's child is back," one minister bellowed. "He may wear a uniform, but his purpose remains to seduce the young." The accusations spread like wildfire again, carried by radio broadcasts, repeated in newspapers that needed sensational headlines. The hostility reached a boiling point in Memphis during one of his first concerts after service. Fans filled the venue to its rafters, but outside, protesters gathered in the hundreds. A preacher with a Bible held aloft shouted into a megaphone, "This man will drag your sons and daughters into the pit." His followers carried placards painted in red letters. "Elvis equals ruin." Some knelt on the pavement, praying loudly, while others shouted at the girls waiting in line, warning them they were walking willingly into damnation. Inside, Elvis could hear the noise through the walls. Stagehands muttered about the chaos outside, but Elvis simply adjusted his collar and walked on stage. He gave no sign of anger. Instead, he poured himself into the performance. His hips moved less wildly than before. The army had tempered him, but the voice, stronger and richer, carried the crowd. Fans drowned out the chants from outside. Yet when the show ended and the curtains closed, Elvis did something unexpected. Rather than retreat to his hotel suite or celebrate with his band, he asked his manager to quietly send a portion of the night's profits to fund a new children's shelter in Memphis. No press releases, no announcements. He wanted it done in silence. To him, it was a gesture of faith, a way to answer attacks without speaking. Weeks later, the story surfaced by accident. A local paper printed photographs of Elvis visiting the shelter. There he was, not in rhinestones, but in a simple shirt, sitting cross-legged on the floor with children around him. He strummed a guitar, teaching them a gospel chorus. The picture shocked readers. To critics, it was impossible to reconcile. The supposed corrupter of youth surrounded by orphans, smiling gently, singing hymns of hope. The backlash fractured. Some religious leaders doubled down, accusing him of orchestrating a publicity stunt. But others, faced with undeniable images of him giving comfort to children, hesitated. Perhaps, one admitted reluctantly, the Lord uses strange instruments. As the controversy raged, Elvis refused to comment. He let the photos, the donations, and the music speak in his place. This silence unsettled his enemies. They had prepared for a fight, but Elvis offered none. Instead, he embodied the very opposite of their caricature. A man quietly giving, quietly believing, quietly refusing to be drawn into venom. The split within the church grew sharper. In some congregations, pastors thundered warnings about his return to the stage. In others, worshippers whispered about his gospel records, wondering aloud if perhaps their children's idol was not an enemy, but a brother in faith. The line between condemnation and recognition blurred. For Elvis, the tension weighed heavily, but did not paralyze him. He carried his gospel roots wherever he went, even as Hollywood cast him in romantic roles and record labels pushed him toward mainstream hits. After the shelter photographs circulated, he began making quiet visits to hospitals and charities, always away from the glare of cameras. He refused to answer critics with arguments. He answered them with deeds. The irony could not be ignored. While headlines screamed of scandal and sin, the truth unfolded in quiet rooms where no reporters stood. Rooms where he sang to sick children, or sat with orphans who clutched his hand as though he were family. Those moments revealed something deeper than fame. They revealed a man trying to reconcile the accusations of corruption with the reality of his own heart. And slowly, ever so slowly, some of his fiercest critics began to soften. Not all, never all, but enough to show that even in a divided America, the truth of a man's actions could sometimes break through the noise of condemnation. For the first time, Elvis saw cracks in the wall of hatred. Not because he had defended himself with words, but because he had chosen a different language altogether. The language of quiet, unpublicized compassion. It was a lesson that would follow him through the rest of his life. That the loudest arguments rarely win hearts. But a simple song to a room full of children sung without cameras, could do what no sermon ever could. By 1968, Elvis Presley stood at a crossroads. The movies he had made throughout the early 60s filled theaters, but left him restless. Critics called the scripts hollow, the songs forgettable, and some whispered that the king's crown was slipping. His own heart knew it. Fame remained, but the spark was dimmer, the fire hidden under layers of Hollywood gloss. Then came the idea that would change everything: a television special. NBC offered him a primetime slot, a chance to remind America who he really was. To many in his circle, it seemed like a gamble. He hadn't stood on stage in years, hadn't faced a live audience outside of controlled film sets. But to Elvis, it was more than a gamble. It was resurrection. The night of the broadcast, December 3rd, 1968, millions tuned in. America was in turmoil: assassinations, war protests, civil rights marches. The nation felt fractured, weary. And onto that fractured stage walked a man in black leather, guitar slung across his body, eyes burning with something the public hadn't seen in years. The first notes struck, and the atmosphere changed. This was no movie soundtrack. His voice was raw, urgent, unchained. He prowled the stage with a power that seemed to shake the camera itself. For younger viewers, it was electric. For older critics, especially in the churches that had fought him for over a decade, it was confirmation of every fear. The morning after, religious publications thundered. "A final warning from Satan," one Baptist newsletter proclaimed. "This broadcast proves beyond doubt that Presley remains the corrupter of youth, his gyrations as obscene as ever." Sermons repeated the same refrains: "Beware the spectacle that seduces the eye while it poisons the soul." But while pulpits condemned, living rooms told a different story. Families sat in stunned silence during the broadcast. Mothers and fathers unexpectedly moved to tears. Soldiers stationed in Vietnam wrote letters saying his songs made them feel less forgotten. Young people, some of whom had never seen him outside reruns of Jailhouse Rock, suddenly realized they were witnessing something larger than entertainment. It was confession, release, revival. NBC's offices overflowed the next day. Letters poured in from every state, thousands of them. Some scrawled in shaky handwriting from elderly viewers, some from teenagers who had saved allowance for a stamp. One letter read simply, "For 1 hour, you reminded us what hope sounds like." Elvis himself felt transformed. On stage that night, he had not worn the smile of Hollywood scripts or the polished veneer of a movie star. He had sung with hunger, with longing, with an edge that came from years of criticism and self-doubt. He left the stage drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, but inside he knew the fire was still alive. And then came the most unexpected twist. A week after the broadcast, as the debates raged in newspapers, a letter arrived not from a fan, but from a church. A Protestant congregation in the Midwest, one that had once condemned him openly, extended an invitation. They asked Elvis Presley to perform gospel music at a religious gathering. The request stunned his team. No church had ever publicly embraced him in this way. Some thought it was a trap, a publicity ploy. Others advised him to ignore it. But Elvis read the letter silently, lips pressed, eyes fixed on the words. He didn't answer, but he tucked it away. For the first time, the fortress of rejection built by the church showed a crack. The irony was overwhelming. On one side, furious denunciations, sermons branding the comeback special as evidence of perdition. On the other, mothers writing to NBC about weeping in front of their televisions, veterans clutching his songs like lifelines, and now, an open hand from a congregation once aligned against him. Elvis understood something that night, and in the days after, that his critics never grasped. Music did not fit into their categories of holy or profane, sacred or sinful. Music simply carried the truth of the singer's soul. And on December 3, 1968, the world had seen his soul bared in black leather under studio lights. It was not sin they saw. It was hunger. It was struggle. It was hope. And though some still shouted Satan, millions more felt something the preachers could not explain. That in the voice of Elvis Presley, there remained not just rebellion, but redemption. Las Vegas in the early 1970s was a world unto itself, bright, relentless, dripping with excess. Casinos hummed 24 hours a day, champagne flowed like water, and neon lights painted the desert sky in perpetual dusk. And at the very center of that neon kingdom stood Elvis Presley. After the 1968 television special, he had been reborn. The International Hotel signed him to a record-breaking contract, and soon the largest showroom in Vegas became his cathedral. Night after night, he walked on stage in jewel-studded jumpsuits, backed by a full orchestra and a choir that made the walls quake. Crowds of thousands, gamblers, tourists, celebrities, packed the room until ushers turned them away at the doors. But outside the glittering entrances, another crowd gathered. Not fans, but protesters. The headlines in church newsletters had returned with vengeance. Presley's shows, the Devil's Circus, Sin City and its false king. Bishops issued statements accusing him of corrupting not only youth but entire families who traveled to Vegas to see him. One declared publicly, "This man is no entertainer. He is a corrupter of souls." The protests grew bolder. One evening, as fans in evening gowns and tuxedos lined up outside the International, they were met by men and women holding signs painted in thick black strokes. Elvis equals Devil's voice. Others raised wooden crosses above their heads, chanting hymns as though trying to cleanse the building itself. Police hovered nearby, holding back the risk of confrontation. Tension spilled into the crowd. A group of young fans, angered by the shouting, argued with the protesters. Voices rose, insults flew, hands pushed. For a moment, the glittering front of the casino threatened to become a battleground. Inside, the orchestra tuned their instruments, unaware that the faithful and the furious nearly collided at the doors. Elvis heard of the commotion minutes before walking on stage. His manager urged him to ignore it. "They're just trying to get attention, don't give them what they want." But Elvis carried the weight of it with him as he stepped into the spotlight. The show began as usual. Rock numbers, the crowd screaming, cameras flashing. But midway through, something shifted. Elvis motioned to the band to stop. He looked out over the thousands seated before him, and, without explanation, he asked the orchestra for a different key. Then, against all expectation, he began to sing "How Great Thou Art." The room fell silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle of feet. His voice, rich and aching, filled the cavernous hall with words of praise, not rebellion. The chandeliers shimmered as though caught in the sound itself. Ushers stood frozen at the back, mouths slightly open. Women who moments earlier had screamed at his dance moves now wiped tears from their cheeks. Outside, the protesters heard it too. The hymn carried through the walls and into the street. The chanting faltered. Some lowered their signs, uncertain. The irony cut deep. The very man they had branded the Devil's voice was inside, leading thousands in a hymn older than their grandparents. Among the protesters stood a figure Elvis recognized even through the distance and glass. The Memphis preacher, the same man who had condemned him from the start in the 1950s. Their eyes met briefly, if only through the tinted windows. Elvis did not sneer, did not wave. He simply kept singing, his face lifted, his voice trembling with a conviction no sermon could silence. The hymn ended in thunderous applause, a standing ovation that shook the showroom. Yet for Elvis, the true weight was not in the ovation, but in the silence that had come before it. The hush of thousands listening, the pause outside where protest had momentarily turned to uncertainty. Backstage, band members whispered about the surprise. One asked him why he had chosen that song, unplanned, unscheduled. Elvis only shrugged. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you gotta sing what's heavier than you." That night, critics again split down the middle. Some papers declared the performance a stunt, accusing him of cloaking sin in holiness. Others, however, described it as one of the most powerful moments in live entertainment history. For the fans who were there, it was something else entirely. It was not a show. It was prayer, disguised as music. The protests would continue in Vegas, but they never quite carried the same force again. Because those who had been there knew that for one night, in the heart of Sin City, the so-called Devil's Singer had brought thousands to tears with a hymn, and no sermon outside the casino could erase that memory. The years in Las Vegas had left Elvis both triumphant and exhausted. Every night, the crowds rose to their feet, dazzled by the jumpsuits, the brass sections, the endless encores. But behind the curtain, he carried a quieter burden, the knowledge that despite all the ovations, some still branded him the enemy of faith. It was in this climate, in the early 1970s, that an unexpected invitation reached him. A group of ministers in Memphis, the very city where his career had begun and where condemnation had once thundered loudest, requested a private meeting. They did not offer headlines or cameras, just a room, a conversation, a chance to see the man behind the image. At first, Elvis hesitated. He remembered too clearly the sermons, the protests, the preacher who had called him a corrupter of souls. But something inside him urged acceptance. Perhaps it was the memory of his mother's prayers, or perhaps the weight of years of criticism. Whatever the reason, he agreed. The meeting took place in a modest church annex, far from the glitter of Vegas. The room smelled faintly of wax and old wood. Narrow windows let in only a little light. Wooden benches creaked as ministers filed in, their collars stiff, their expressions cautious. Elvis arrived quietly, without an entourage, dressed not in rhinestones, but in a simple suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes tired but alert. The opening words were not kind. One of the older ministers, his voice sharp with conviction, spoke first. "You have stolen a generation," he said. "Why should we trust anything you say? Why should we believe you are not the very danger we warned against?" The air grew thick. For years, Elvis had imagined what he might say if ever confronted like this. But now, with their eyes fixed on him, he found no need for arguments. Instead, he moved toward the upright piano in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. Without asking permission, he sat down. He pressed the keys gently, then began to sing. The song was not one of his chart toppers, not a piece of rock and roll. It was Amazing Grace, the hymn he had learned as a boy, sung beside his mother in small country churches. His voice filled the small room, low at first, almost hesitant, then swelling with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the wood of the pews. The ministers, who had entered ready to debate, fell silent. Some folded their hands, others simply stared. The melody seemed to carry not the voice of a celebrity, but the confession of a soul laid bare. By the second verse, a change had come. One minister, younger than the rest, bowed his head, his lips moving along with the words, Another, who had spent years condemning Elvis from the pulpit, found tears pressing at his eyes. He wiped them away quickly as though ashamed, but they returned. When the hymn ended, the silence lingered. It was not the silence of suspicion nor of hostility. It was reverence, the kind that follows when words feel inadequate. Finally, one of the harshest voices among them, the same preacher who had once shouted outside concert halls that Elvis was the devil's tool, spoke softly, almost reluctantly. "I see now," he said. "You do not sing about sin. You sing about pain, about longing, about faith." His voice cracked slightly. "And perhaps we have not listened closely enough." The room shifted. Shoulders that had been stiff with judgment eased. The ministers did not rush to embrace him, but something fundamental had changed. They no longer saw only the jumpsuits, the screaming girls, the glitter of the stage. For a moment, they saw the boy from Tupelo, who had grown up on hymns and prayer. Elvis closed the piano and stood. He did not argue, did not demand their approval. He had given them a song, and it had said more than any defense ever could. After that evening, word spread quietly among churches. One congregation that had once condemned him now admitted publicly, "Elvis Presley has not turned people from God. He has led some to seek him again in music." It was not universal acceptance. Many still clung to their condemnations, but it was a crack in the wall that had stood for nearly 2 decades. For Elvis, it was not victory in the worldly sense. There were no headlines, no applause, no triumphal photographs, but it was something far more important: peace. He had stood in the very heart of judgment, and he had answered not with anger, not with defense, but with the hymn that had carried him since childhood. And in that silence, when the last note of Amazing Grace faded into the air, he had felt something he rarely felt on the grandest stages of Las Vegas: acceptance, not from the crowd, but from God. By the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley carried both the glory and the cost of his crown. The stages were still full, the tickets still sold, the women still reached for him with trembling hands, but behind the spotlight, his body faltered. Years of punishing schedules, sleepless nights, and prescription pills had taken their toll. His frame grew heavier, his movements slower. Yet when the music began, something inside him still burned. Critics, as relentless as ever, resurfaced their old accusations. "The corrupter of youth is now a shadow of his former self," one columnist sneered. Others recycled the familiar charges from decades earlier. "His influence remains poison." They could not resist reopening old wounds, even as he struggled through pain simply to walk on stage. But Elvis never answered them. He saved his energy for the only language he trusted: song. And in June 1977, at what would be his final concert in Indianapolis, he gave an answer that no sermon could undo. The arena was packed, the air electric, but also heavy with a strange awareness. Fans could see the fatigue in his eyes, the strain in his movements. Yet when the time came, he did not launch into a hit single or a showstopper. Instead, he chose gospel. His voice, roughened by years and weariness, carried the words with raw intensity. For those listening, it felt less like entertainment and more like testimony, the confession of a man standing near the end of his road. The crowd fell into a reverent hush. People wept openly. Some raised their hands as though in church. It was not Las Vegas glamour, not Hollywood polish, but something stripped bare and holy. For a fleeting moment, the king of rock and roll ceased to exist, and in his place stood a man of faith, begging heaven to hear him one last time. Among the thousands in that arena sat a figure Elvis knew well. though he hadn't seen him in years. The preacher from Memphis, the same man who had once branded him Satan's voice, who had stood outside concerts with crosses and condemnation, was now older, grayer, slower. He sat quietly in the audience, his Bible unopened on his lap, tears glistening as he listened. When the last note faded, Elvis whispered a few words to his band, audible only to those close by. "They may never understand me, but if one soul feels love in my singing, then I didn't sing in vain." Those words became his final testament. Weeks later, the headlines would blare with news of his death at Graceland. Papers spoke of addiction, decline, scandal. Obituaries dissected his career, some praising, others mocking. But amid all the noise, one voice rose with startling humility. The Memphis preacher, once his fiercest enemy, spoke softly to a small gathering after hearing of Elvis's passing. "I called him the devil," he admitted, "but I was wrong. He was a man who sang with his soul, and that soul reached mine. It was not shouted from pulpits or printed in bold letters, but for those who heard, it carried weight." A man who had once condemned Elvis with fire and fury now offered words of confession. And in that confession lay the truth. Elvis Presley's legacy was not measured by the fury of his critics or the frenzy of his fans. It was measured by the quiet power of a song that could reach the lonely, the broken, the searching. By the tears of a soldier in a barracks, the smile of a child in a shelter, the silence of ministers moved to reverence, and the final surrender of a preacher once hardened by judgment. When the world remembers him, it often recalls the screaming, the rhinestones, the flashbulbs. But those who listened closely remember something else: the hush that followed a hymn, the trembling of his voice as he gave more of himself than his body could afford. Elvis's life ended in Graceland, but his last word was not scandal or spectacle. His last word was song. And for those who heard it, whether in a crowded arena in Indianapolis or in the quiet of a late-night gospel record, it was not the voice of a devil. It was the voice of a man searching, longing, and offering what faith he had left. A voice that even his harshest enemy finally called human. A voice that lingers, not in applause, but in silence. Silence heavy with something like prayer.